Hi, class. Welcome to my lecture on fallacies. And this is a lecture I like to give as part of the research paper because, as I kind of explained at the very beginning of class, or at the start of class, when we first started this session, is that rhetoric, has multiple aspects to it. There's ethos, there's pathos, there's decorum. But one of the things I've mentioned is that logos logic, right, is not as strong as it should be, right? That logic sometimes gets pushed in the background and you see a lot of emotion, you see a lot of credibility, but not a lot of logic. And this is where fallacies come into play. And this is very important when it comes to research papers because above all, you want to avoid these fallacies. So it's an important thing to go over. And so let's just get started, as there's a lot of fallacies to go through. I will try my best to do this as, well, not quickly, but with a reasonable pace. All right, so what are fallacies? As stated here, they are defects in an argument that weaken an argument. Fallacies are illogical arguments, right? They make no logical sense. They can be emotional, sure, but they're not actually logical. If you really think about it, about what's being said, about what you read, about what you hear, it doesn't make logical sense. They're fallacious in that sense. There are two important things to realize about fallacies. They're so very, very common. You see them all the time in politics, unfortunately, on the news and advertisements. Those ads you saw that you analyzed for your first assignment, those were full of fallacies because they're just purely emotion. There's no logical reasoning behind any of them, and you'll see this as we go through this lecture here. And number two, it can be sometimes difficult to see fallacies if you don't really look at something carefully because they happen so quickly. It's like if you see a debate, like for 15 minutes, if you know what you're looking for, even if you know what you're looking for, you will miss some fallacious arguments that are being thrown out here and there from any side of the political spectrum. So just something to keep in mind. Very common, sometimes hard to evaluate because they happen so quickly. So let's get to it and describe some fallacies. Number one, big important fallacy here. The first one, a straw figure fallacy. And what is a straw figure? It's also known as straw man, but more, I think, common straw figure. And the idea is that you have a really strong argument. And in this argument, your opponent cannot defeat. He's just like, oh man, that's a good point that person brought up. I don't know what to say against it. So instead of actually addressing that argument, what they do is make a weaker version of that argument and then knock that argument down and call it good. Then the strawman fallacy is truly done once they knock that weaker version and say, hey, I won, see, because I beat it. That's the straw figure. So here I have an example, a real world example down here. Back in, oh gosh, whenever Obama was making his push for healthcare reform, the oppositions, the Republicans, the other side of it said, if you are voting for this to pass, you will allow for death panels. Your doctor will be able to kill you. Is that what you want? What really happened was that there was a clause in that healthcare reform that you, before this happened, right, you signed up for this, say, if I was in an accident, I became brain dead for whatever reason, I was just a vegetable basically, I give permission to terminate my life because for the most part I'm gone. It's just a corpse that can't, like, that's breathing but it's not actually physically there. That's all it was. That's what I was talking about. However, as you saw, the argument was distorted. It was made weaker. It was made as if it didn't, if it wasn't about the original argument. Yes, it's about your doctor being able to kill you. Is that what you want? That's not, no, that wasn't logical. That's not at all what this was about. That's a straw figure. That's an easy example, and it's a real world example that you saw, or some of you might have seen when that was going on. But straw figure, that's the first one. That's a very important one. I see that happening sometimes in your research papers because the argument of the oppositions that you're bringing in, you're not giving them the whole credit. You're just making a weaker version of their argument so it's easy to knock them down. You have to give the best version of your opponent's argument to really accomplish something, to really go over what you're trying to say, to really address it in your paper. So, straw figure. One thing actually before I move on is that I'm going to move, I'll have this PowerPoint I'm using now on Canvas so that you guys can go through it on your own and click on these links here. These links are taking you, they take you to some YouTube videos that it just would be too long if I showed it in this lecture, but if you click on it in this slide, you'll be able to see more about this given fallacy, and for the really important ones, I give you some YouTube videos or more examples and such. So feel free to do that if you need more information about these fallacies. So second fallacy, red herring. Okay, red herring sometimes gets confused with straw figure, but they're really easy to differentiate here. Red herring, you have an argument, right? And the argument is going to a certain conclusion. However, you, for some reason, for whatever reason, because maybe you don't like where the argument is going or you don't like where the conclusion is going to head, you go on a completely different tangent. You completely lose your, you go on, you talk about something else completely unrelated and you conclude on that. That's red herring. It's when you often never return to the actual argument. You just go off on rails and you never really go back to the original premise. So here's an example that you see all the time. Mr. President, what should we do about global warming or climate change? It seems to be an issue. A bunch of scientists have proven it's happening. What should the U.S. People or what should the U.S. government do? Oh, I'll tell you, Sally, global warming, that's a really important question. That's great. But you know what's more important right now? More Americans need to worry about jobs. Jobs are the most important thing right now, and that's what we need to focus on. Jobs, jobs. You see that happening, right? Not necessarily that. I mean, well, yeah, maybe that example, but you know, you get asked a question, you acknowledge you get asked the question, or they get acknowledged that asked the question, but they never actually answer it. They go off on some other tangent, and they go to they don't even really talk about the original issue at hand. This happens all the time, unfortunately. And this is very important that you avoid in your research paper. You do not want to start an argument and then go off on a tangent instead of going on the original argument you were making, and then conclude on something else. That's so confusing for the reader, and it's not actually what you were discussing in your paper. So be very careful when you're doing a red herring argument. Or to avoid a red herring argument. And again, there's another video here that goes into more detail on this one, because this is another one I see a lot when it comes to student writing. Okay, ad hominem and to QQ. Okay, ad hominem. Basically, all this is instead of addressing the argument that's presented, you attack the opponent's credibility. Now, yes, it is a very good rhetorical move, but it isn't actually addressing the argument. And you see this happening in politics all the time. So the idea is someone presents an argument and the opposition's like, you know, why should we believe so-and-so and what they have to say about this? They're not a good person because they're smelly and they're, you know, they don't pay their tickets. I don't know, whatever you want to attack them, right? The idea is that you're not addressing the argument. You're just trying to attack the other person to discredit them so you don't have to address the argument. And that's clearly a fallacy. You're not even trying to discuss what's going on, whatever issue is going on there. You're just trying to attack the other person because you want to avoid the argument altogether, because maybe you don't want to, because maybe the argument is actually good against you, but you don't want to address it. So again, it's just really attacking the person's credibility. So here I have an example. In 2008, people attacked Hillary here because of her relationship with Bill Clinton, right? So in 2008, when Hillary Clinton was going for the Democratic nominations opposing Obama, a lot of people attacked her character for being married to Bill Clinton. And they would say, oh, well, how can we believe Hillary Clinton? She's married to Bill. As we know, Bill's a liar, right? But tell me, is Hillary and Bill a single entity? Are they one person? No. You have to judge her by her own actions, not by someone else's. So that's the idea of ad hominem, 2QQ. You have to address the argument at hand. Sure, like I said, it is a rhetorical move to attack somebody's credibility, but that's not enough. You have to also address the issue at hand. Okay, on to the next one. Oops. Appeal to pity, appeal to ignorance. Pretty simple. Appeal to pity. Basically, you should believe the person because they're pathetic, because you feel sorry for them. Basically, it's an emotional appeal, right? So the person's like, you know why you should believe me? Because I'm so pathetic. I got to feed my kids, and I have kittens to take care of. Please believe me. That's an appeal to pity, right? There's no logical argument to be made there. They're just trying to appeal to your sense of pity. Ignorance is pretty common, unfortunately. Basically, they make a claim, and they're like, hey, there's no evidence to say anything against what I'm saying, so I must be right. That's not how it works. That is not how logic works, okay? Just because there's absence of evidence doesn't mean you're right. It just means that there might needs to be some studies, or it might need to be proven, but it doesn't make you right necessarily, okay? That's an appeal to ignorance. Hey, this is how I think things are. There's no evidence against it, or at least I don't know of any evidence against it, so I must be right. Most of the time, there is evidence. You just don't actually look for it, or you don't actually read it, or you don't actually, look online for like 2 seconds. That's an appeal to ignorance. It happens all the time. And most of the time when they say that there's no evidence against me, so I must be right, there is evidence. There's a ton of evidence. They're ignoring it. That's hence an appeal to ignorance. Be careful, okay? There's always a lot of information. You have to look at it carefully. And just because you don't know it doesn't make it right. Hasty generalization. All right, hasty generalization here. This is an important one because all stereotypes, negative and positive, are born out of this fallacy. Basically, what hasty generalization is making assumptions about a whole group just because of a single sample. I'll give you some tame examples. Oh, my librarian is shy and smart and loves books. Therefore, all librarians are shy and smart and loves books. Maybe a majority does, or maybe many do, but you can't really say all of them do. My math class is hard, therefore all math classes are hard. It might be hard for you. Doesn't mean it's hard for other people. Maybe for some people it's rather easy because they enjoy math, right? That's a very tame example. You'll see this also all the time in ads. And if you click on this link here, it's just an example of multiple ads that show you hasty generalization. So one is just a Taco Bell commercial where the lady brings a chalupa or something like that with a bunch of bacon on it, and then she attracts a bunch of guys. And of course, the hasty generalization there is that, hey, guys, all guys love bacon. And again, that's a hasty generalization. That's not logical. What? Sure, maybe a lot of guys do like bacon, and I'm sure a lot of women do too. Doesn't mean that everybody does. Doesn't mean that every single man in this world right now loves bacon. Okay. The next example is like an Axe spray commercial, and it's a guy spraying a chocolate scented spray or whatever, and then it shows a bunch of women going crazy over him or whatever. And the hasty transition in that case is, hey, all women love chocolate. Again, maybe a lot do, sure, but not every single person would like chocolate, and so on and so forth. That's the idea, right? But again, also any kind of like really bad stereotype that I'm sure all of you know comes from this fallacy. It's why you have to keep it in mind. It's illogical. It doesn't make sense. It's not fair. But you have to understand that it is a fallacy. So, hasty generalization. Missing the point. Okay. So you have an argument, and the argument makes a lot of sense, right? It's following from A to B and B to C. Ooh, excuse me. So everything makes sense. It's pretty logical so far. However, the conclusion makes no sense. It comes out of left field. It goes. You're like, what? What's going on? And the conclusion doesn't really connect with what the argument that was being made. That's missing the point, and that happens sometimes in research papers. Let me give you an example. I think I have one right here. Yeah, perfect. So let me read you the example, and let me you'll get a sense of what this fallacy is about. The seriousness of a punishment should match the seriousness of the crime. Right now, the punishment for drunk driving may simply be fine, but drunk driving is a very serious crime that can kill innocent people. Okay, so you're with me so far, right? So drunk driving is a serious crime, right? Everybody agrees with me, right? Okay. So there should be a serious punishment for such a serious crime, right? Yeah. Everybody agrees there. I don't think anybody would really argue against that. All right. So the death penalty should be used and the punishment for drunk driving. Right? Death penalty. We should use the guillotine specifically. A little too extreme, no? It came out of nowhere. That is missing the point. You have a good argument, but then the conclusion just is like out of nowhere, and you're like, whoa, wait, what? So yeah, I mean, this example is a good one. Drunk driving is serious. That makes sense. It needs a serious punishment. Yeah, of course. We should use the guillotine to kill them all. Whoa, okay. That's missing the point. And that happens sometimes in conclusions in a research paper. Your conclusion just doesn't match the evidence you present. And so it's almost like you're just making the conclusion up. Okay, so be careful on that. Post hoc, very important, also called false cause. Basically, assuming that B comes after A must have caused B. So how, it's a little tougher to do here. I don't know if I have a program to really show like, I can't believe I'm missing a little word program that I can draw on. But anyways, basically, there's an event. Just imagine this, my arrow here there's an event, like a line coming up, right? Something happened. And then, as soon as this event happened, another event happened at the same time, unrelated to the first event. However, because the first event happened, people or someone is assuming that this event is causing this event. That's false cause. Unless you can logically and with statistics, with evidence, support the idea or prove that A is causing B, then it's just a post hoc, false cause. There's no correlation, does not equal causation, basically. There's no proof that A caused B or vice versa in any way. Okay? The idea is not to confuse certain events because you think they're related to each other. They might be, but unless there's logical evidence, you can't make that assumption. Otherwise, it can be very, very dangerous. Here's a very good example. So, in the early 2000s, the early aughts, I guess, whatever we call them now, there was a rise of autism in kids, right? A lot of kids were becoming autistic, and a lot of parents and a lot of doctors, everybody just didn't know why. We were still unsure as to why that happened. We had no idea. So that was one event that happened, right? A lot of kids were becoming autistic. Well, that's strange. What are we doing to all our kids? That's the common denominator. Vaccinations. That's what was a lot of people's thought. It must be vaccinations. There was no logical proof that said vaccinations was causing autism. And yet, because of this fallacy, a lot of people decided to stop vaccinating their kids because of the assumption that it caused autism. And look what we have now. We have viruses. We have diseases that we got rid of in the 50s coming back because we stopped doing this. because of this assumption that autism was caused by vaccinations. That's why this is very dangerous. False cause, post hoc. Correlation does not equal causation. There must be logical evidence. Otherwise, it's illogical. And it can be incredibly dangerous. All right, on to the next one. Loaded question. All right. So basically, you asked a question that is, the presumption is no matter how you ask it, it's going to make the person who is being interviewed or being asked look bad or appear guilty. Basically, so saying something along the lines of, hey, you, let's say, hey, Steve, are you still parking in the handicap zone? And he says, no. Oh, man, I can't believe you parked there before in the past. Oh, my gosh, I can't believe you did that. You're not even handicapped. Or he says, yes, why are you still parking in the handicap zone? You're not handicapped. That's mean. You see what I'm getting at? The idea is that you asked a question that no matter how they answer, they're going to look bad. So here's another example. Mr. President, are you going to send troops to help the poor refugees in Syria, let's say? And the president says, no. Oh, okay, so you're going to let the Syrian people die, and you're going to let this atrocity happen. And then he says, okay, yes. Oh, so you're going to send our troops to die, and you're going to get us into war. So that's a loaded question. The idea is that no matter what they say, they're going to come out looking like the bad guy. That's not fair to them. You have to give them a fair chance to explain their situation. Slippery slope. Okay, slippery slope. Oh, jeez. Here's another good one that you guys have to try to avoid in your research papers. Basically, the arguer is making some kind of arguments, right? So A, B, and C, right? And so forth, as shown here. However, A doesn't necessarily lead to B. It doesn't make any logical sense why it would lead to B. B doesn't necessarily would lead to C. It makes no sense. It could, maybe, but it's not actually like a good logical chain. And then when you get to the end of the chain, which would just say is D, D is like the apocalypse. It's like the worst thing ever in the world. So do you want to avoid D? You better not do A. Basically, they want you to do something. And it gets progressively worse and then until it gets to the very worst thing ever in the world. So to avoid that, you better go and do A. That is slippery slope. Let me give you an example. It would be an easier way to explain. And we probably all have gotten this from our parents at some point, or maybe from someone that was taking care of us. But I'll use myself as an example. Pierre, get up early on Saturday. If you don't get up early, you're not going to be able to do your homework and finish it. If you don't do your homework and finish it, you're not going to get good grades in high school. If you don't get good grades in high school, you're going to be a dropout. If you're going to drop out, you're going to end up at McDonald's. Huh? You want to end up at McDonald's? Then you better start getting up early in the mornings. Do you see how none of that really made sense? None of that chain. I heard it all the time and if you're a mom too, you might use it with your kids as well. This illogical slippery slope, and it's one of those things. But just because I don't get up early in the morning doesn't mean I'm going to do bad at my homework. Just because I do bad at my homework doesn't mean I'm going to not do good in high school. Just because I don't do in high school doesn't mean I want to drop out. Just because I drop out of high school doesn't mean I will end up at McDonald's. But there it is, right? That whole chain of, oh man, if you don't do this one thing, you'll end up at McDonald's, right? That's the idea. That is a slippery slope. And for those of you familiar with old DirecTV commercials, they did this all the time. If you don't get DirecTV, you'll get an eye patch. If you get an eye patch, you'll be beat up and you'll end up in a ditch. Do you want to end up in a ditch? You better get DirecTV. That makes no logical sense. It might be funny, right? That's the whole thing, the humor. But logically, none of those chains make sense. Now, slippery slope sometimes gets confused with missing the point. But in missing the point, everything makes sense up until the conclusion. With slippery slope, none of the chains really connect. Sometimes maybe A and B does connect, but then B and C don't connect, and then C and D don't connect, and then the conclusion, of course, doesn't make any sense. Here's a real-world example I heard back when I was younger, like in 2005. when people were still arguing if we should allow gay people to get married, and the argument against it, and this is pretty stupid, but this is something a politician said, was, and this isn't verbatim, but this is basically what he was claiming. If we allow gay people to get married, which is A, then what's to stop us from letting people get married to animals, and then letting people get married to trees, and then and then if that happens, it'll be chaos, it'll be apocalypse, it'll be like Mad Max, it'll be the end of the world. Do you want it to be the end of the world? We can't allow gay people to get married. Yeah, I know, ridiculous, but that was an argument that was made, and that was a completely slippery slope argument, completely illogical, didn't make any sense, and yet that's what it was used. And that's what you need to know about these. You need to be able to call them out, because these happen all the time. And of course, I want to make sure you avoid them in your research paper. I don't want you to make a slippery slope argument, and I will let you know if you do, because it's something you want to avoid as much as possible. False dichotomy, black and white. Basically, there's only two options, and that's it. It's either left or right, and there's no other ones. Or it's black and white, and that's it. You're either with me or you're with the terrorists. That's not true. There's usually multiple options. There's a variety shade of gray. There's not just white and black. There's so much more, right, in between. But that's the idea, that there's only two options, that you're either with it or you're against it. And you see this a lot, this argument. Hey, you're either with me or you're against me. That's it. There is no other way. The idea is that they're trying to get you to go on their side, and if you're not, you must be with some other third group, or whatever the case is, right? This was a very common argument being made when I was 18 or 19 after 9/11 happened. And if you're trying to argue against the war we were going in Iraq, you were basically, you weren't arguing that you were just saying, like, why are we going there? That doesn't make any sense. That wasn't where the terrorists came from. And the argument against, so then you must be arguing for the terrorists. And you're like, no, I'm just wondering why we're using all this manpower and all these lives. But good luck. Good luck trying to do that then. Passions were high. People were shut out or shut down because of the tragic event that happened right afterwards. But this is basically the argument that was made against you. You're either with the U.S. or you're with the terrorists. That's it. Which, of course, was completely untrue. There were so many other avenues that was happening. Just because you argued against what was happening with the war does not mean you were with the terrorists. But that was the argument that was being presented. So, false dichotomy, black and white. On to the next. Begging the question or assuming the premise. Okay. So one thing that's a little confusing about this is that begging the question is really more, like it says here, assume and question premise. So basically, you're presenting proof of your own claim that virtually says the same thing. So, for instance, my English 101 class is awesome. You know why it's awesome? Because it's so great. Yep, proven. Don't need any more. Need to look into it anymore. It's done. As you can see, that didn't prove anything. I used my own statement, or virtually my own statement, to provide proof to the original premise. That isn't logical. Of course, you're not proving anything. You're just trying to sidestep the issue. I'm great because I'm awesome. That's not proof. That's begging the question. Sometimes people use this in a phrase like they're talking about something and they're like, that begs the question, what should we do now? That's not the logical fallacy. They're just using the phrase incorrectly technically, because when you say begging the question, you really are you should be referring to this fallacy. And again, it should be really called assuming the premise. But whatever. So here I have an example. The word of Zorbo the Great is flawless and perfect. We know this because it says so in the great and infallible book of Zorbo's best and most truest things that are definitely true and should not ever be questioned. Also, Zorbo is great because his book says he's great. So, do we figure out why he is flawless and perfect? Because apparently he's great, and his book says he's great, so we know he's great. That's begging the question. You're basically providing your own proof as a premise, and you're not really giving actual evidence to support your claim. Weak analogy. You could think of it this way. You have a weak, you're trying to use an analogy, or perhaps even a metaphor, which is, part of an analogy, or analogy is part of a metaphor, to explain your argument, to supposedly simplify it, but it's not working. It doesn't make sense. And you know this as if you've gone through my metaphor lecture from, what was it, last week or the week before, you know that certain metaphors don't work. They're off, or they're not quite correct, or they're mixed metaphors. And this is what a weak analogy is. It's a fallacy. It doesn't work. It doesn't connect. Here, let me give you an example. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools with metal parts that can be used to kill someone. And yet, it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers. So restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous. So we shouldn't restrict any guns, because they're just like hammers, and we don't restrict hammers, and that would be silly to restrict hammers, right? Done. The debate's over. No. Guns are not like hammers. You can make the argument. You could use someone can go around and start, hitting people with hammers and try to start killing them. Sure, they could do that. They would have a tough time, though. They might be able to get one or two people before they're stopped, especially if it's in a crowd, and they'd be stopped very quickly. Comparing that to a gun, like an AR-15, a machine gun or a rifle, whatever, an automatic rifle, they're not at all the same. Guns are not like hammers. Sure, they both have metal parts, yeah. But what are their intentions? What are their supposed uses? What's a hammer for? It's to create something, right? To perhaps nail something in, whatever, right? A gun's only use is to shoot and potentially kill. That's what it's made for. A hammer has multiple applications. They are not all alike. Trying to make a bad analogy here doesn't help your case. This doesn't make any logical sense. We don't restrict hammers because we can't use them for mass murder. That's why. So yes, and we should restrict guns potentially because they can, especially heavy automatic rifles. That's the idea. That's why a weak analogy is important to understand, because they're used all the time like this to make a point or to make a claim that it's not logical. Appeal to authority. Just because someone's a teacher, a police officer, the President of the United States, doesn't make them right. Just because they're famous, just because they're a movie star, just because they're on television, doesn't make them right. Just because they have some sense of authority, or whatever that case is, right? Just because they have a high position, doesn't make them right. That's an appeal to authority. You have to listen carefully to what they say, because just believing them because of their authority doesn't make them right. This happens all the time, right? You get someone famous to promote something in ads, right? And you're like, oh, well, he's famous. I like him, so this thing must be great. Not logical. How would they know? Just because they are a really good movie star, or just because they're on television? It doesn't make them right. Just because they wear a badge doesn't make them right. That's appeal to authority. Ad populum, to the people, otherwise known as bandwagon. Just because it's popular doesn't make it right. Just because the majority thinks it's right doesn't make it so. The majority of people might look up and say, oh, sky's red, when it's actually blue. You look up, you see blue. Everybody else thinks it's red. Well, to you it's blue. Because they're wrong. I don't know what they're seeing. They're not seeing the same sky because it's not red, it's blue. Here I have an example. Gay marriages are just immoral. 70% of Americans think so. So what? I don't care if the majority thinks gay marriage is immoral. It's not right. Gay marriages should be allowed to happen. I don't care what Americans think. That's the idea. Just because it's popular, just because the majority thinks it's right, doesn't make it so. Burden of proof. Basically, saying that the burden of proof doesn't lie with you who made the claim, but the other person, the opposition. So you said something along the line of hey, this is why I think I'm right. Prove me wrong. You're the one making that claim. Why should I have to prove you wrong? You have to prove yourself right. That's how it works. That's the logic behind it. That's burden of proof. No true Scotsman. Okay, this is an interesting one. Okay, so it's kind of, related to hasty generalization a little bit, but a little bit different. Basically, no true Scotsman fallacy is the idea that you have a preconceived notion in your head of what something should be based on a small sample. And if it breaks that, you kind of say, oh, well, that must not really be what I'm thinking. So it comes from like a Scotsman, like a Scotsman would never put sugar in his porridge. But then this Scotsman was putting sugar in his porridge, and the other guy was like, well, then you must not be a true Scotsman, because no true Scotsman would put sugar in his porridge. But he was, and he was like, what's your point? I don't care. I want sugar on my porridge. That's where it comes from. So let me give you an example using my own experience as a Latino. And I know actually this class online was never seen, but I'm light-skinned. My father's dark-skinned. My mom is lighter-skinned, and I inherited her skin tone. My sisters are more like my father, and me and my brother are more like my mom in that sense. As such, when I was growing up, a lot of people didn't realize I was Latino, and I can speak perfect Spanish. Mi español está, well, puede ser un poco mejor, pero ahí está. But anyways, basically, as I was growing up, a lot of people, when they found out I was Latino, was like, wow, you're so well-spoken. I didn't think you were Latino. Your speech is so eloquent. That's great. And they said this as a compliment. Although it was very, very much not so. Very much a backhand, right, to my culture, to my family, to where I come from. Just because I didn't meet their preconceived notions of what a Latino male should look like. I don't know what they were thinking. Should I be dressed a certain way? Should I have an accent so they know I was from that I was from a Latino background in some way? Either way, they were so shocked to learn, and just like, oh, you're so light-skinned, I can't believe you're Mexican, or I can't believe your parents are Latino, or you don't look like any Mexican I know. That kind of stuff. No true Scotsman fallacy. Just because I don't meet your preconceived notions doesn't make me any less Latino. I'm proud of where I came from, and that is something you just have to kind of accept. That's a no true Scotsman fallacy. The idea that just because it doesn't meet your preconceived notion, it doesn't make it so. Be careful. It works kind of along with hasty generalizations. The fallacy. Yeah, there's so many fallacies that this is another name for one. Basically, the claim is argued poorly, so they dismiss the whole argument completely. So maybe someone is arguing for climate change, and his opponent is really good at arguing against it, but the opponent that's arguing for climate change is just doing such a poor job at it. He's just doing just a terrible, terrible job. And the other guy goes like, see, climate change isn't happening. This guy can't even argue for it, arguing that it's happening. So we should just dismiss the whole thing. Yes, it might be true that the guy arguing for it is a bad representative of it. He shouldn't be arguing for it. Maybe they should get somebody else. And maybe that's his weakness. But the actual argument that's being made, the overall climate change is happening, is a real thing. As such, you can't dismiss that. That's the fallacy. Anecdotal. Here's a good one. You use personal experience or an isolated example or a single example as compelling evidence. So basically, it happened to me, therefore it must happen to everybody else. My experience is indicative of everybody else's experience. Not necessarily. Here's an example. My grandfather smoked and drank every single day of his life until the ripe old age of 90. Therefore, I'm sure you can just smoke and drink every single day of your life and you'll be just fine. Try it, right? Try it. I wonder which cancer will get you first. Throat, liver, uh, esophagus, whatever. The idea is just because it happened to that one person, that singular case, that isolated example, doesn't mean it's going to happen to the rest. Be careful. Your personal experiences are important, of course, but that's why I always try to get you to see other people's perspectives, because yours is just one example. And it could be just a singular thing that happened once, a singular thing, a singular isolated thing. Doesn't mean it'll happen to every single person. Appeal to nature. Basically, the idea that, hey, it's natural or it's not natural, you should do it, right? Just because you say something is natural it doesn't mean it's valid, doesn't mean it's good or ideal. Who defines what natural is? We do. As a society, we say this thing is natural, and there we go. And if it doesn't fit this, then it must be wrong. Not necessarily. Just because you say something is natural doesn't make it right. So what? And be careful. Appeal to nature. Genetic fallacy. Basically, this was an important one. You argue that the thing you have in front of you, the argument you see here, isn't worth looking at because it comes from a certain source. So you're like, I don't want to read this article because it's come from CNN.com and I don't like them. But you're not actually even reading the article. You're just dismissing it. You're not even, who cares where it came from? The article itself might be very important and might have a really good argument to say. Just because it comes from a source you dislike personally, that's a genetic fallacy. You're not actually giving it the credit it deserves. So before I stop this and call it good here, just some tips for finding some fallacies. Pretend you disagree with the conclusion you're defending. So basically, if you are saying, hey, climate change is happening, what would people going to say against it? And how would you defend that? List your main points and list your evidence under those points. Basically, you're making claims. Make sure you have evidence to support those claims. Otherwise, they'd be fallacies, right? Learn which type of fallacies you're especially prone to. So like I said, slippery slope, straw man, red herring, and missing the point are usually the big ones. Learn which ones you kind of fall into so you can avoid them. Be aware, of course, that if you have a very broad claim, that it's going to need more proof than narrow ones, which is why for your research paper you need to have as narrow a claim as possible. And of course, double check your characterizations of others. Avoid hasty generalizations and no true Scotsman fallacies. All right, well, this video is long enough. This is just a quick, of course, well, I don't know if that was quick, but just a lecture on fallacies. Afterwards, after you've gone through this, please do the discussion on fallacies that you'll have this week. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next lecture.